It's time to move on to the next phase of this project. I've got the engine stripped out of this car, I've got it tore down, and now I need to get any other little bits and pieces off this Passat that I'm going to need for the swap into the Tacoma. And it's up in the air, I've looked it over underneath, there's really nothing under this car that I need to take off. So at this point it needs to come off the hoist so that I can get this space back for other things. I'm going to get it moved over to the flat stall area so that I can start tearing all that other stuff out of this thing, and then I can get it just out of here. It's cold out. It's 5 degrees out here. It's nose hair freezing cold. So I'm going to play musical cars because I need to move this Jetta and my truck around to get the Passat out of the garage. We'll do a little cold start video on this thing. It's been sitting out here all day. God, I actually hope it starts because I really don't want to have to push this thing. Oh yeah! All right, Jetta. Come on, warm up. Warm it up. Now we gotta get the truck started up, and we can move that too. Well, I gave this Jetta about 10 minutes to warm up, and as you can see, it doesn't look like it even did anything. It's still freezing cold in here. Other than the heated seat, I'm thankful for that. It's pretty toasty. I'm going to try to move this thing, and then I can get that Passat in here. Unlike the Jetta, the Tacoma's already up to operating temperature. It's nice and warm in here. Everything's melting off. I know that doing this diesel swap is going to affect the warm-up cycle of the truck, getting up to temp so that I can, you know, drive it in the wintertime. That's just going to be one of those things I'm going to deal with. I'm going to try to do a few things on the build to help with that cold start. Oh, yeah. Well, that pushed pretty easy. I was actually surprised how easy that rolled. Just Flintstone in it. Whew. Good. Backseat party time. I'm going to start by getting the fuel pump out of this car. I think that's a good place to start. I need this to swap over into my Tacoma to supply the engine with fuel. So when I was cleaning this car out, I did notice that there's an access panel right underneath this rear cover. I think once I get that off, I'll have access to the fuel pump, and I can try and get that thing out of here. Alright, this should be ready to come out of here. I don't know. It's kind of tight. We're going to pull these connectors out and see how much of a mess we can make in here. Oh, there it goes. Ooh, man, that is some dirty looking stuff down in there. Wow, it's tight. Holy moly. Okay. Come on. I don't want to break it. I want to take it out intact. Something's hooked up. Okay. Wow, it fills up every millimeter of the space. There it is. Okay. Yeah, and this tank was like 3/4 full, so I also need to drain all that out. Maybe I'll reuse this fuel. I can burn it in my tractor or something. Look at that. That's probably original. Look at all the gook in there. Yuck. Well, it still works though. Well, here's the fuel pump out of the Passat. It's looking pretty nasty, but it's like 20 years and 300,000 miles, so I guess that's the kind of junk that accumulates in the tank. Now all I need from this is really just the electric fuel pump part. I want to install that into the fuel tank of my Tacoma. So I need to get this electric fuel pump part out, but I'm also curious on the fuel flow path here. I can see, obviously, got electrical connectors that go down to the pump to power it on. And then out of the top of the pump, I see this bigger tube here. That goes up through this little bulkhead, and that appears to be the outlet. There's an arrow even pointing away. There's another one that's pointing towards it, so that's the return. And that comes down this tube. I'm sure it flows into the bottom of here as kind of like the return into the suction side of the pump. And then you'll see this little itty bitty tube here. Now this one flows, looks like out of the top of the pump, and then it flows back down here into a little valve. Now, done a lot of fuel pumps, and usually that's some kind of a siphon, or not a siphon, but like a siphon jet. I'm not really sure what is on the inside of that. This might be like some kind of built-in pressure bypass. I'm not sure. So I'm gonna get it apart, and I want to see a little bit more of what's going on in here. After some fumbling around, I was able to get this fuel pump assembly apart. So this is the lower can that the fuel pump sits inside of. Here's a strainer that helps, keep the fuel clean, I guess. And it was definitely straining some junk over its lifetime. This thing is all blocked up with junk. Something interesting, let's see. This is just the return that I pulled out. So yeah, that just drops right down in here and goes back into this can. So all that fuel can stay here. There's also this little jet here. So this comes off of the feed side of the pump. So pressurized fuel is coming down here. There's a little tiny orifice there, so it's squirting fuel. That snaps into here, and that sprays the jet of fuel down this tube, and there's a slot here, so it creates like a suction point of Venturi. So that's drawing fuel in this tube, and then inside of this can, there's actually, I don't know if it'll open up. There's a little trap door in there, right in the bottom. I bet I can open it up. I don't know if anybody can even see that. There it goes. There's a little trap door in there, so that's pushing fuel in, kind of swirling it around inside of here, keeping this thing full of fuel, so the pump's always got fuel to feed the engine. Thought that was kind of interesting. Also, that trap door is going to keep fuel from coming back out as well. So I got to dig a little bit more off of this pump yet to get it out. The strainer's got to come off before it can come through this diameter bore here that it snaps into. There's a little locking foot down here too. So I'm going to get this off and get it apart. Whoa, it's slippery. And then I want to see what this other little valve is on top. Just fueling my own curiosity here, I went ahead and took this teardown a step further. I pulled this cap off here on this side of the pump up top. Inside there's a spring-loaded plunger right here, and that sits atop a hole down inside of here. So that is on the pressure output side of this pump. So that's going to help with some kind of pressure, fuel pressure control, because that's on this side as well as the fuel barb out to the engine, and then this one. They're all on the output side of the pump. So this one has a purpose in the tank, in this collector box, as it's being used to help pull more fuel inside. But because it's, using that, it's bleeding pressure off the pump, I might want to keep this on here when I put it in my truck. Not sure. I won't know unless I actually bench test this and run it at running voltage and see what the fuel pressure difference would be if I didn't run this or if I did, if that makes sense. For now, I'm just going to keep all this stuff together, bag it and tag it, and then I'll revisit that later when I put it in my truck. Now I'm going to move on to the electrical harness. So earlier I pulled the computer and the harness off the engine, and everything that went up to the main connector underneath the wiper cowl. So I need to move further down from there, go inside the car, and pull more of that out. This is a wiring diagram for this particular car. It's got all the modules, all the wiring, what's what. For now, I'm going to pull out everything that I think I'm going to need and then some, because I'd rather have too much than not enough. And then once I get the wiring out of the car, I can kind of assess it more easily on the bench and strip it down from there and just keep the things that I really think I'm going to need for my truck. There's a whole lot of room under here now with that engine out, and the harness that came out with the engine pretty much came out as one piece. There's one spot here that it tied into. There was a ground that went onto this stud along with this ground, but the rest of the harness passed right through here, and then the ECU was sitting right here under the wiper cowl. And if you look under that, you'll see a foam sealing gasket, and then those are all the connectors that were plugged into it. And then they go down under the dash from there. So I need to get into the car and pull a few panels off, and then I can get a better look at what's going on under the dash and get all that mess out. With those panels out, you can really start to see how much stuff's hiding under here. The fuse panel here, all these relays, more fuses down here. Another key thing to point out is going to be this OBD connector for the computer. That's important to save. Also, the throttle pedal here. And there's a harness going to that, so I got to pull that kind of stuff out. And it's a whole mess of stuff under here, so I'm just going to pull it out. And once I get it out, I'll lay it out, and then we'll look it all over. Oh boy, look what I got myself into here. So let me start with, I know it's a lot. There's a lot going on, but this is where I started. I pulled this connector down from way up under here, under the wiper cowl, because this is the bank of connectors that sat underneath that black ECU box, and they kind of plugged in. So even though a lot of the stuff in the ECU is kind of contained on just the engine side itself, there are a few things that are carried on into the car. And depending on what you want to do with your swap, you got to decide, how minimum do you want it? Because there are some things in here that you absolutely need, and there's a lot of stuff that you really don't need. So, but for me, what I learned from my old buddy Justin, just in case you want to, I want to take more than I need, and then I can just dissect it later and delete. So I'm also curious to see where all this stuff goes. So I went and pulled this down, stripped off all that sticky fabric tape, or they call it Tessa tape. It's really a pain in the butt to peel off and not cut any wires, so you really got to take your time. And then I just went through wire for wire, and I just kind of tugged on them, pulled on them until I kind of found out where they went. And then the stuff that was able to extract and pull out on its own is here, including, that one's a fuel pump relay. That's an important one. That's a mandatory one. And then anything that kind of continued on and went way up into this harness, like a lot of these twisted pairs of CAN bus wires, those I know they're gonna go up into the dash, they're gonna come down here, they're gonna go into the cluster, especially looking at the wiring diagrams. I'm gonna leave all that in. This harness and the wires that I can't get out all the way yet, a lot of them are throttle pedal and brake switch. I know that they go up and over and behind the support of the dash itself, and then I can see where it comes back down here, and then behind like the radio area. I don't want to pull all that out, and I'm sure a lot of people that are doing swaps, they don't care to strip their swap vehicle down to the bare minimum and get every little inch of wire out. You really don't need to. What I'm really trying to do is just get the pigtails out, and I want to have enough wire to play with. So I peeled this back as far as I can get it. I'm going to snip it up there. I'll take this. This is the brake switch. This is going to be useful for cruise control stuff if you're going to do that in your swap. And then this connection in here, which is for the throttle pedal. So I'm going to cut that next, and I'm going to cut all this out, and pull it all out. And what's left in the car, I'm going to leave there for now. I don't see the use in pulling it out. It's not worth my time. I pulled the rest of the wire out from underneath the dash of the Passat, and then I bundled everything up, rolled that car outside, and brought in my layout table. So all the components that I removed from the engine, which is the main engine harness, and all the relays and that connector block that was underneath the ECU box, that's all laid out on this table. So I'm pretty sure I got everything out of that car that I'm going to need. Pretty sure, mostly sure. I think it's okay. If anything, I think there's probably more than I'm going to need. Honestly, the main engine harness back here, I believe, is probably 95% of everything you need to run the engine itself. And then there's going to be just a few things here and there that are mandatory, and then quite a few things that can just go away. So I'm going to pan around the table, look at what we got, and kind of explain what some of these things are. Maybe if somebody's never seen these connectors before, maybe you want to do one of these swaps yourself. You'll know what you're looking at, and you'll know the things that you need to retain, and then by the end of this video, get a good idea of what you don't need if you really want to be on the bare minimum. Here is the ECU that I pulled from the car, and its plastic box that it sat in. Really nice, actually. Keeps it clean and tidy. This slotted window here, that's where this bank of connectors was sitting under inside the vehicle, and there's all these really nice color-coded connectors all the way down. So looking back over here, you'll see all the connectors that plugged into those are right here, and they go into this harness. Down here we have the main power relay, this 219 for the ECU. So when the ignition's switched on from the key switch, it's going to power this up and power up a lot of things that are tied to the ECU. This big boy 80 amp that's fed to this constant power, that's for the glow plugs. The 10 ampere, I believe that one was for the oxygen sensor heater circuit. And this 15 amp one, they call that the injector fuse. It's a 15 amp. So moving down the harness, trying to make this quick because there's a lot of stuff, and I want this video to be a million years long. There's a big ground here. This one is the, oh my gosh, coolant bottle. Don't care about that. These two connectors I didn't label because I'm pretty sure these ones have to do with something in the front core support harness, like maybe the fans and AC. Not totally sure, not worried about it. This guy here, turbo EGT. So that's the turbo temperature factory BHW stuff. I don't know if I can log anything with that, if it's worth keeping, or if I should just get rid of it. This one here is the oxygen sensor. This one's very important. It's your glow plug relay. That's what it looks like. Following this down, what's this little guy? Oh, this is your vehicle speed sensor. Probably not going to need that because I think this is independent from here to the cluster. This goes to the transmission, by the way. And then where it branches off over here, this is the starter circuit. So this is going to switch the relay on the starter and start the vehicle. This harness I don't plan to use because it is part of the Passat, and I want to use the one from my Tacoma. So whatever swap vehicle you have, you're likely not going to want to use this. But in the wiring diagram, somewhere in this circuit here, there's a red-green wire that ties back to the ECU on the startup. So that's something that you probably want to tie in later. We'll get to that. Here is a fuel temperature sensor that was backed by the tandem pump in line. Map sensor, it's important, keep that. Injector, harness plug, that's a big guy, goes back of the head. Coolant temperature sensor, it's a 4-wire. 2, as far as I can tell from the diagram, go to the ECU, it needs to know that. The other 2 probably are shared and they go back to the gauge and the cluster, which you don't need, but it is a 4-pin, that's what it is. Down this harness further, it branches out. Yeah, oil pressure sensor. Also a good time to mention that older cars, high mileage, they've been through a lot. Look at this one's breaking right here. I'm going to need to get a new connector for that. So honestly, this pressure sensor is probably a dummy light for the dash. So I'll probably not even use this anyways. I'll use the Tacoma one. But keep in mind, all these connectors are old. Like this glow plug harness, look at all these are breaking. This is something that you can't replace on the BHW. It's integrated to this whole harness. I believe the ALH and some of the other ones you might be able to buy just the glow plug harness. So something like this, I'm going to want to look at getting some new connector pieces that'll plug into my glow plugs. This one here's the alternator. Again, another connector that I can see it's starting to get a little worn down in here. This alternator plug does have at least one important wire here. There's a blue. The blue wire feeds all the way through the harness back into the dash. It needs that trigger wire
from the alternator to properly power it on. So that's going to be something you're going to want to wire back to the dash in your swap vehicle. Over here, continuing on, what is this one? This is the, intake flapper shut valve thingy. Probably not going to run that. Does keep it, I believe, from dieseling on and on and blowing itself up. This is what's left of my EGR connector. Not going to run that. Further down, we also have your MAF, which I plan to keep. This one is the PCV heater. I don't know if that's, most people are probably going to get rid of it. Being in a cold climate, I don't know if that's something I want to keep or not. And the N75 boost control valve. So that's everything on the engine side. Going this way, another probably absolutely mandatory thing is this electric throttle pedal. You need this. And the connector. The brake light switch, I pulled that whole sucker right out. So figured car's probably going away. Anyway, so I have all the wires pinned out what they do for cruise. And then I went a little bit further because I was just kind of seeing how the flow path of wires went for the cruise control. So the steering wheel here has the cruise switch in it. It bolts on here. You'll see there's these two connectors. They plug in here and here for the cruise switch. That goes into this yellow connector, which is going into the clock spring. So here's the clock spring that's behind the steering wheel. And that plugs in there. And then on the back side, you've got all this wire that feeds through that. And then you also have another connector that's going into here. And this one plugs in here and has some wires that appear to also be relation to the cruise control. That was just kind of for my own doing. I wanted to see how that all worked and synced up. But cruise will be one of those things that I add later, and that's one of the options that I'm going to be working with. So at this point, I'm going to stop here. I'm going to cut a whole bunch of this stuff open, and I'll bring you in once I narrow all this stuff down to what I'm going to be using as my bare minimum harness. This is my stripped down harness. I removed all the protective covering from it so that I could inspect all the wires and connectors, and it made it a lot easier to extract the things that I did not want to keep. Before I get too involved here, I wanted to start by talking about these two connectors. There's a black and a gray 3-pin connector. They weren't tagged previously because I didn't know where the heck they went. When I was removing the harness from the engine, I could not see where these wires went. They kind of tucked along the block. They go to the crank and the cam sensor, and they're kind of buried. So now they're tagged. I know where they go. Make sure you keep those. Let's go talk about the things that I pulled out of this harness. Let's start with this here. This is I believe it's called the intake valve flapper. I think it has something to do with possibly preventing it from running away. Maybe it can shut the flapper door and try to choke it out. But I also believe it has a function with the EGR recirculation. But here's a connector for that, and all the wiring I removed and peeled that out of the harness over there. The next one I decided to eliminate was this PCV heater. That's this guy here in the intake tube. I don't see any reason why I need that. I've never had a vehicle with it. I know a lot of people get rid of it. So just one more thing I don't have to deal with. This is the starter solenoid switch wire. It was actually tied into the heavy wire that went to the starter too. But since I'm using the Tacoma side for my swap, I pulled that out. This big mess of wires for the EGR, mine was melted and the connectors all destroyed. A lot of people don't run EGR. I'm eliminating it too from the harness. So other things on this part of the table are the throttle pedal, which I think I mentioned before. You're going to need that from your donor vehicle. The connector, this is as much pigtail wire as I could extract without removing the entire dash and everything from the car. That's plenty for me to work with. The brake light switch, really, this is more for cruise control, which I do want to venture down that path at some point to get it working in my truck. I pulled the whole thing out, and as much wire as I could get. If you don't want it, then don't worry about it. This is the diagnostics port connector here. It has 7 wires in it, and I guess I'll quickly talk about what's what. You're going to have a twisted pair for the CAN bus. That's going to tie back to the ECU, so it can communicate there. There's a green wire that's called the K-Lines Diagnostics Communication. That's also something you can, that's important to tie into the ECU. There's a wire for that. There's also this black and red. This one is going to be a switched power fuse wire to the connector. There's also a constant, I believe, 10 amp wire here, and 2 brown ground wires right here. This is the bank of colored connectors that I was talking about. And to simplify things, I made myself a little chart. This breaks down where everything goes. So as I labeled wires and pulled them out, I wrote down what they are, where they go. The things that are highlighted in these boxes are things that you definitely need to keep. The things that are not are things that are like the cruise control, some AC stuff. If you're not going to run that, don't worry about it. There's also just a couple things in here that I'm not 100% sure what they do, so I kind of left those in there. I think it's important to first talk about the ECU and how it's pinned out. So this is a Bosch ECU, number EDC16U31 out of my Passat. You'll see it has 2 connectors. There's a big one and a small one. Big one here has 94 pins in it, therefore it's called the T94 connector when you reference the diagrams. And then this one over here has 60 pins, and they call this the T60. So looking at the T94, there's lots of wires going to it, but there's a couple independent wires in here. You got your main ground. So on the Passat, it was tied to the firewall. So that's something you're going to need to ground to your swap vehicle. And this one over here is the starter solenoid. I don't know if it's a sense wire, but it was tied into the starter solenoid circuit. It does go to pin 86. It's a small red and green wire. I don't know what the ECU is looking for when it sees this, but I'm going to plan to tie this into the starter solenoid on my Tacoma, the factory one, so it sees it as it would in the Passat, if that makes sense. Now, actually further moving down this harness, I should probably talk about, I think I mentioned before, these are older cars, they got a lot of miles on them. Definitely inspect all your connectors. I mentioned before this alternator plug, it's starting to crack here, these wires. So I did find a pigtail, not terribly expensive. That's something I'm going to fix while it's apart so that I don't have a problem in the future with this. Also the glow plugs, they do not have a replacement harness for these like the ALH and maybe some of the other TDI stuff. So as far as I can tell, these wires go down here, these heavy black wires, all the way down the harness. They wrap around and go right to the glow plug relay. I did find some replacement leads. They look to be kind of short, and they had like a terminal connection, but there does not appear to be anything in here like that. So I think what I'll end up doing is maybe buying 4 of those, and then I'm just going to have to splice them in, and then that'll, fix these before they become a problem. So that's my plan for that. Moving back down here to my chart. Now we can talk about what these connectors do. Starting with this black connector here, there's only one real important wire in this one, and that is going to be the alternator wire. It's like the exciter wire that goes from the bulb indicator light in the cluster up in here. So it goes from there through here to this blue wire, and then it picks up right over here on this blue wire and feeds all the way back to the alternator itself. That's something you're going to wire into your swap vehicle so you get that switch power on the alternator. I plan to do that in my Tacoma the same way the factory one is. I'll just splice into that to feed the alternator to make that happy. There's a few other things here in this side of the black connector that are not important, but I just want to mention there's like a coolant level sensor connector there. The vehicle speed sensor also ties into this black connector, and there is this oil pressure dummy light. So that oil pressure one I just want to mention, that's one that you're going to want to just use the one that fits your swap vehicle so it can satisfy the signal to the dash. That makes the most sense. The vehicle speed signal from the Passat transmission doesn't seem to be important. I haven't seen anybody using that. It sends its signal through this cluster, does some kind of voodoo magic inside there, and spits a signal back out. Actually, we can see that on my sweet chart right here. It's actually in the tan connector. There's a white and blue vehicle speed sensor to speedo cluster. It's in the T94 connector at pin 90. I don't intend to use that. I don't really know what the ECU is looking for in that. So for now, I'm not going to worry about it. But let's look at the other wires here. There's a black and blue. It's a fused 15 amp. That's going to power the MAF. So that actually goes right from a switch source somewhere under the dash. I cut that off. It's a pretty heavy wire too, this black and blue. Goes up through this connector, picks up here, and you'll see right there, it's same color but a lot smaller. That's going to feed the MAF all the way there on the other end. So definitely get that power supply to your MAF. You could probably tie it in at another switch power source, maybe even the one that ties to switch the ECU on, like this main power relay. That's a possibility there, whatever's easiest. I do think it's critical on some of these switch powers that you find not only power in the on position, but the start position, because if you key on and then you start, you might drop power to certain things like the ECU or like the MAF, and then it's going to lose that signal and might not start. So be aware of those inputs. There's another wire in this tan connector. It's the green and black. That's the K-lines communication. It's in the T94 at pin 72. That's where it ends up. That's just this guy right here, this little dude. It spliced into a lot of stuff under the dash in the in your donor vehicle. It's talking to a lot of other things on that I guess network communications, but it's not important anymore because it's deleted. So it's going to go through that connector, pick up right there, and end up at that T94. Make sure you get that one spliced into your diagnostics port plug so you can read codes, clear codes, communicate that way. That's going to be a very important one. Moving on to the red connector, you got your CAN bus wires there. You got their orange brown, orange black. It's CAN high and low. They're in the T94 at pin 66 and 89. You'll see they're going to be a twisted pair, these CAN wires. So if you're not going to run CAN stuff, don't worry about it. But if you're going to have like some kind of a scan gauge, or you're going to do some communications to the ECU through this, then you're going to want to consider splicing that back in. Pretty much everything on the CAN network of this car, this Passat, seems to kind of, there's like a gateway hub right here, or an interface, where a lot of CAN wires kind of tie into the cluster. I'm not going to use the cluster, but there's so many systems that talk on that network in the Passat that are not needed anymore. So another thing about networks is they're going to have a terminating resistor at the end of the line. It kind of cleans up the noise in the circuit. I believe the ECU is got one resistor in there for the CAN bus network. The other one, I don't have detailed schematics for Volkswagen. I just got like generic stuff. Other factory access stuff that I have, I can see that on diagrams. So I don't know where the other one even is in the circuit. But just something to be aware of if you want to run something through the CAN bus network. There's another very important wire in here. It's going to be the fuel pump supply power. It's a red and yellow wire from the 219 relay. So from this one over by the ECU, power is going to go up through that red connector into this big red and yellow, and you'll see it goes right up into your 373 fuel pump relay. So when this is switched on, power can flow through and then actually out of this green wire to whatever fuel pump that you're going to run, lift pump in your swap vehicle. That'll be a fused power to that pump. Let's skip over now to these that are outside of the highlighted area. We got this defog idle boost signal. It goes to pin 85 in the T94. It's a little black and yellow wire. That one's right here. Honestly, it's more of a sense wire. I couldn't find much info on it in the defog circuit. It does go back to the ECU for some reason. I'm just going to guess the defog circuit being a high current component. When it's switched on and it's heating up that grid on the back glass, it's drawing down the alternator. The ECU might see that as a input signal to maybe add some fuel and up the idle to try to maintain so it doesn't lug the engine, kind of like when the AC is switched on, or when your power steering pump's going lock to lock and it's really bypassing and loading the pump, it kind of stabilizes the idle. That's my guess. I'm not 100% sure on it. I don't even have a defrost grid on my Tacoma, so I'm not even worried about it, but just be aware that that's in there. Same with this AC relay control. So it looks like it's a cutoff for the AC relay. It's a black and gray wire that goes through this red connector right here. And I don't know if I'm going to use that in my truck. I don't know if it's needed. I'm going to leave it for now. I want to try to get AC working on this thing. I might try to use most everything that's in the Tacoma though. So, but if that's an AC cutoff, so that like if you're going to, you know, load the engine and it just cuts the AC out for the extra power, that might be what that's for. Moving over to this orange connector now. There's a 12 volt switch power to wake up the ECU. It's pin 18 at the T94 connector. So that is right here. Make sure you get that to a switched ignition source so that it will function correctly. That also has the fuel pump relay control that switches the fuel pump relay on. It's red and blue at the ECU. It's pin 52, but when it goes through this connector, it actually turns into a blue colored wire, and that's what's going to latch and turn on power to that relay. Make sure that that relay gets wired in properly with your swap vehicle. Lastly, the white connector here has a very important wire. It's a big main battery power supply that goes through it. So get that one tied in. So that'll power up your stuff. Let's skip over all this stuff because it's cruise control related. If no one's going to use it, then don't worry about it. But all the pin numbers and colors are in here. You can see all that there. There's also 6 throttle pedal wires right here. Those ones are very important. Obviously, it's mandatory. You need that to run this engine. Those are all just kind of taped up right here, all 6 of them. And what I'm going to do is just splice that into the throttle pedal when it's in my truck. Just make sure you get color for color, you know, properly connected so you don't get anything crossed there. These 2 I taped off just for now. They're part of the brake light switch circuit that goes through the white connector. And that is something that I'm going to figure out later on when I start doing the cruise control on the truck. So these down here are just things that I made mention of earlier in the T94, that relay sense wire. I don't think I need it, but it was there on the factory Volkswagen side. So, you know, I figured I should probably just tie that in just because that's how they engineered it. Don't know what it's looking for. Make sure you get that main ground, that brown ground we talked about. The T60, I just wanted to mention, those are the things I deleted. So they're just tied off here. They're going to be inside the truck with the ECU. So I'm just going to cap them off and tape them up in the harness. They'll be safe, fine there. Other things on here are the glow plug relay battery supply. So that is that big boy right there. Make sure you get that wired in so that relay can get those glow plugs hot and happy so that works. These other little fuses, I don't know if I'm going to keep these holders or put in another universal style, but that will, those need to be in place for other systems to function. So keep those. And let's see, I already talked about the diagnostics plug. Bare minimum, you got your 2 grounds, your K-line communication, and a switch power. If you're going to, again, run some kind of a CAN bus circuit, make sure you get those spliced in so you have a constant power that might power some kind of a gauge at the diagnostics port and CAN communication back to the ECU if you want to tie that in. Now, the terminating resistor thing I talked about earlier, I'm not sure if that's going to be an issue or not with this because I don't have full diagrams on the CAN network and I don't know where the other terminating resistor is in the circuit. I haven't really seen many people talk about the CAN bus on these. Again, probably not even going to run it. So if you're not, then don't worry about it. I think that's pretty much everything. So honestly, just focus on the things, like I said, that are highlighted here. And then as far as this connector goes, I went above and beyond. I don't do a lot of Volkswagen stuff, so I'm not familiar with how they run wires, you know, and what's in these circuits. So I pulled a lot more out than I need to. So by doing this, I hope that people can see you can just cut what you really, really need, you know, based on that chart and what we talked about for your swap. Leave all this other stuff in the car, save yourself some time and headache that way. But this was mostly meant to be a detailed visual representation of everything that's in the car and what you can pull for your swap and basically what you're getting yourself into. So I hope people find this helpful. I'm going to leave the harness open until I can get the engine in the truck. And then from there, I can tidy it up and wrap it up later. So I hope you enjoyed the video. I will see you in the next one.